The following 90-minute presentation is part of the UC Master Gardener series. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UC TV programming guide for the date and time when other lectures in the series will be shown.
I would bet you that 90% of the questions you might get as master gardeners are going to be pest problems. And that's true in all of the different commodities and crops that you deal with. But in grapes, that's generally the case. And we're very fortunate because we have a wonderful reference. And this is available in the Master Gardener Library. It's called Grape Pest Management. Can't be any easier than that. It's a nice winery, Napa winery on the cover. Any disease you could possibly imagine, any insect problem, is going to be found in here. And great pictures. If you go through there, you can go through and do diagnostics, look and see if you can find your particular problem, match up the pictures, and then it talks a lot about general methods of control and about the biology of the problem. What it doesn't do is give you a lot of chemical solutions, because that changes all the time. They didn't want to put it in a nice permanent book like this. So what you want to do for that is rely on your other Master Gardener publications, some of the pest notes that are available, and the pest management guidelines that are available. Okay, first of all, when we're talking about grapevines, generally in California we're going to be talking about Vitis vinifera, or the European grape. And this is what all of our commercial varieties are, whether we're talking about wine grapes, raisin grapes, or table grapes. They're all the European grape, Vitis vinifera. It's native to the Mesopotamia, the Middle East. So you need to think about that when you're thinking about where grapes are grown, what kind of climates are right for grapes. Table grapes, there are certain things that we look for in table grapes, very different from wine grapes. When you want table grapes, you want large berries, large plump berries, a lot of water in them, moderate sugar. They don't need extremely high sugar. Table grapes are really quite difficult to grow compared to other types of grapes. They're very, very highly trained and manipulated. When I talk to commercial people about growing grapes, I tell them they can grow wine grapes on the weekend if they want to do that. But if you're growing table grapes, more than a few vines, you're going to be out there working a lot on them. You need to go in and you need to do thinning. You need to do special training. By thinning, I mean removing bunches, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. You go in and do other operations to them, girdling. You put special sprays on them. Grapes in nature just do not look like they look in the grocery store. It takes a lot of work to get them to look that way. So what kind of table grape varieties can we grow in the foothills? Generally, we can grow most varieties. I say that. For backyards, we can grow just about any variety of grape. Commercially, I probably would not tell you the same thing. There are some varieties that just don't ship well, that may be more prone to frost or more prone to problems. Three of the best varieties that I like for the foothills are Flame Seedless, Thompson Seedless, and Black Manuka. And I'm sure you're familiar with Flame Seedless and Thompson Seedless that you see in the grocery store all the time. Flames, I think, are particularly nice for the backyard because unlike Thompson's or Manuka, they'll hang on the vine for a period of time. So if you had a large arbor with 100 bunches on it, you could pick 10 bunches a week, and then pick a few a week later, and pick a few a week later. Thompson Seedless doesn't do that quite as well. It'll continue to get sweeter and sweeter and become more ambered. It'll hold for a while, but it definitely changes. Flame stays nice and crispy and crunchy regardless. Black Manuka is a variety you'll never see in the grocery store, so you might be interested in growing it in your home. It produces very large berries that are seedless naturally on its own, and the only problem is the berries slip off of the stem quite easily, and they're very prone to juicing and rot, so it doesn't pack well. They can't put it in boxes and send it to the store. So people love to grow it in their backyard. You can get nice big berries, even without using sprays or without girdling. It's very interesting. As you know, when we used to have table grapes, most of the table grapes had seeds in them, right? Some of the older folks in the room remember when we ate those kind of grapes. We don't want those anymore. The challenge is, with table grapes, it's the seeds that produce the hormones that make them nice and large. So when you start producing varieties that don't have seeds, they're not very large unless they get these additional measures to make the fruit plump up and enlarge. Let's see, any other table grape varieties anybody was thinking of in particular? There are some muscat varieties that do well. Really the only ones I would discourage you from, Perlet is very tough to grow. It's very tight. It's very early growing, so it's going to be very prone to frost. Very tight bunches. And then the other variety is Crimson. Crimson Seedless is a good variety. It's a newer variety. It's a red seedless variety, very late season. It's okay to grow, but it's very vigorous. And when we talk about pruning, it's going to be one I'm going to tell you you're going to have to cane prune, and you need to leave a lot of wood on it to slow it down. Crimson Seedless, another good one. Raisin grapes, you're probably not growing raisin grapes here in the foothills, but I throw this in for two reasons. Not everybody realizes that raisin grapes are Thompson Seedless, and that 80% of them in the world are produced right around Fresno in about a 50-mile vicinity. And we're the only place in the world that dries them in the sun naturally. Most other places in the world have to use dehydrators. So we do produce a very unique product, the color that they are. They don't have to be sulfured heavily. So we call these natural or sun-dried raisins. The other reason I show this slide is because that is what Thompson Seedless looks like naturally. Think back to the last slide I showed you with the nice big plump Thompson Seedless. And you can see how different it is if you're growing raisin grapes. And I mentioned all of the manipulation that they would do to a bunch. If this were a table grape variety, they would have to come in and they would, early in the season, they would lop it off there, and they'd probably take off 2/3 of the bunches on the vines. So very, very different. A natural Thompson is about this size, as opposed to being great big berry. They cut the grape clusters. They'll thin them several times during the season. They'll thin it when it's a flower. I'll show you some pictures. They thin when it's a flower. They'll thin the whole bunches. Table grape growers leave about 2/3 or more of the fruit on the ground. Trust me, you would be shocked. People get upset when I just go out and prune their grapevines. If you saw me thin your grapevines, you would just not like it at all. Wine grapes. Okay, wine grapes. Now, I mentioned before in table grapes, we want a nice large berry, plump and watery and juicy. We want just the opposite with wine grapes, believe it or not. You want a tiny, tiny berry with lots of skin and seeds and lots of intense, rich flavor. So in many ways, we do a lot of sort of the opposite practices that we would do with table grapes. Instead of being plentiful in watering them, we deficit irrigate them. We put on as little water as we possibly can to keep them growing, to keep the green parts of the vine growing healthy, but have the fruit stay small. Again, in the foothills, we're able to grow a lot of different varieties. I think we're growing about 60 or 70 varieties in Amador and El Dorado counties. Of course, we're known for Zinfandel. We are a hot area, so generally we do better with reds. We do better with the varieties that come from the southern parts of Europe. Zinfandel does well. We do well with Cabernet Sauvignon, although you need to look for some cooler sites. We certainly can grow Merlot. Of the whites, it's a little trickier. We probably do better with something like Sauvignon Blanc. Chardonnay is a tougher one to grow for two reasons. Again, it starts growing very early in the season, so it's more prone to frost. Also, many people just think it's too warm here and you don't get the same characters. You can grow characteristics. You can grow it here, but it isn't going to taste like a Carneros Chardonnay or a Napa Chardonnay. But for home winemaking, it's probably just fine. Now, all of those grapes that I was talking to you about are the European grape, Vitis vinifera. We do have other species of grapes. The most common one as master gardeners that you're going to hear about is Vitis labrusca, which is the Concord grape. And Vitis labrusca is very, very different from these European grapes, and it is native to the east coast of the United States. Concords, of course, are what they make like Welch's grape juice out of, has that very distinctive taste to it, and you don't find that present in the European grape. That chemical compound that's in Concords is only present in the labrusca and some of the other species. There are also a lot of other species all around the Americas, both in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. We have Vitis californica, a green leafy vine that you'll see growing in the American River Canyon, all over in creek beds in California. Doesn't have much fruit on it generally. If it has any, it's little teeny tiny clusters of fruit, almost looks more like a Virginia creeper, which is closely related to grapevines. There are other species from Arizona, Texas, all over the South, and we use those extensively in breeding rootstocks, which I'll talk about in a bit. Climate, this last week has been a great reminder to people that we can't forget about frost. So many times we get frosted in the foothills. This is so critical. It takes about 180 to 200 frost-free days to get a crop ripe. Now, if you want to do the math there, you're going to need about 6 months. And as a general rule, what I would say is if you're getting frost in April or May, last year we got a frost on May 11th, then you're going to get damage to the vines. So you need to think about frost damage. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about what you're going to see as a master gardener with frost damage in this slide and the next one. The other temperature consideration that you have to think about in the foothills is our extreme winter temperature. Often it's not a problem, but if you're in a place way up at higher elevations and you're dipping down to below the teens, you could be getting damage to the dormant wood as well. Frost is damage to green tissue or the emerging bud. Winter injury is to dormant wood. Here you can see a good example of frost damage, and this happens to be a little shoot that was out a little bit, and you can just see what happens. It just turns into a crispy critter, really. You can't see anything immediately, takes a few hours, and then it starts looking a little bit, limp and kind of transparent. And then after a few hours and sometimes days, it'll just be crispy and brown. Now, the tricky thing about frost is that it doesn't kill the grapevine, and it doesn't kill all the foliage on the grapevine. And I'll show you why, and I'll show you why you're going to run into this as a master gardener. There's the bud on a grapevine, and even at this stage right there, that could be potentially susceptible to frost. And you have this little diagram on your sheet, too. A grapevine bud is a compound bud that really is made up of 3 buds. And you can see that there's the very large one in the center. That's your primary bud. That's the strongest, it's the first one to grow, and it's going to be the one that grows normally in most years, and it's going to have the most fruit on it. It typically has 2 bunches on it, sometimes more. If you get frosted, that is what dies. If you get frosted, one of these little buds that's tucked down below will start to grow because the other one died off. So what happens is you get this secondary shoot growing. The problem is the secondary shoot often doesn't have any fruit on it. If anything, it might just have 1 bunch. So you might talk to somebody and they'll say, well, I've got this vine and it doesn't have any fruit on it. And you can ask them if they were frosted. And they'll say, well, temperatures dipped down and I thought I got frosted, but I didn't. I didn't because they grew just fine. And what happens is these other shoots grew, but when you get back down in there, there's no fruit on them. So can you grow grapevines in frosty areas? Absolutely. Can you produce fruit in frosty areas? No. That's the clincher. You can grow beautiful foliage. You can have pretty vines. Soils, this is a real easy thing to talk about in a master gardener class for grapes because they are not picky at all. You can grow them in sand, you can grow them in clay, you can grow them in rocks. The one thing they don't like is change. They just as soon have a solid profile of the same type of soil. But really, you can grow them in just about anything. That's another reason that they're such a good crop for us to grow commercially in the foothills. We have so many poor soils, and they'll grow very well. You can grow them in shallow soils. You can grow them as long as you have about 18 inches of soil. That's not very much. But if you grow them in a very shallow soil, you're going to have to add more water and more nutrients to them. You just have to think of soils as that large reservoir that holds all of the nutrients and water for those vines. So if you don't have that reservoir to hold that, then you're going to have to supply it more frequently and in a greater amount. The last thing that vines don't like are wet feet. They don't like having their roots wet. So if you're in a swampy, boggy spot way down in a low area, that can be a bigger problem than them being dried out and not watered at all. Planting grapevines. In the simplest sense, all you need to do to plant a grapevine is take a dormant cutting, take a piece of dormant wood, and stick it in the ground, and it will grow. That'll work. The there's probably not too many problems in doing that, except that only about 50% of them will grow. So if you think you want to make cuttings and grow grapevines that way, go ahead and take about twice as many as you need. You can even plant 2 in one spot if you want to do that. The other thing you can do is make a rooting out of them, grow them 1 year in a little nursery bed, and let them develop some roots and just grow. But generally, you're going to buy a plant. And if you buy I would suggest you do that. Because if you take cuttings, or if you take cuttings and make rootings, it's good because you're asexually propagating, so you're getting exactly the same plant material as the parent, right? But you're also getting all the problems that the parent had as well. You could be taking virus disease with you. You could be carrying some other pathogens along with you. So generally, I say buy a plant. You're much better off. Commercially, we don't plant grapevines on their own roots anymore. We always plant grafted vines, bench grafts or field budded plants. And I'll talk to you about why we do that when I get into the pest management section. You can plant green growing plants with grapevines as well. You can plant them during the dormant season. From March, April on into May, you can plant dormant plants, or you can plant green growing plants in June, July, August. However, the earlier in the season, the better they'll grow. The easier it is, the more forgiving they are. You don't have to worry about heat stresses or other problems. Okay, trellising and training grapevine. As I mentioned, I think at the pruning demonstration to you, we don't have to train grapevines. We don't have to prune grapevines. They'll do just fine growing on their own. The only reason we do that is so that they can be managed, so that we can get in there and spray them for diseases, we can get in there and pick, and we're picking at a level that we can reach, and we're not picking way up in a tree someplace. Trellising has been around for many years in grapevines. You don't have to trellis grapevines, though, and certainly in a backyard situation, you don't have to at all. But I want to give you some guidelines on trellis, because often people will choose to do it even on a fairly small scale. Wine grapes can be trellised, but they don't have to be. Table grapes really should be trellised. And the reason for that is, again, you've got that fragile fruit, and you want to have enough vine canopy to go over and protect those from sun bearing down on them, especially on varieties like Thompson Seedless. You also want to have a trellis up there to hold that canopy up, because you're going to have to get in there and do all that work to them that I was talking about. You don't have to. If you don't care how your table fruit looks, you don't have to have it on a trellis. And there are a lot of different systems that you'll see. And I just want to run through them very quickly, because I know you've seen them as you're driving down the highways here, so you'll kind of know why we do the different things. Head train spur, probably the simplest training system. You see this all over Amador County in the old Zinfandel. We still do this we still plant young vineyards now with Zinfandel in this way, but really that's about the only variety we still do this to. It was done back when we didn't have trellising, and back when we used tractors for all our cultivation, and you could cross-cultivate in between these vines. Generally very low production, however, you can't get huge crops on these vines. More often, you'll see bilateral training, bilateral meaning going both directions, bilateral cordon. And the cordons are the arms. We talked about this out in the field. I think this is the trunk and this is the cordon. And then each of these is a spur position. So this is bilaterally cordon trained and spur pruned. And these are the T-shaped vines that you see all over California. You can let them grow in just a sprawl, which is quite common. But now, more and more, for disease management and for quality, you'll see that people are putting all these additional wires in them so that they can train the shoots vertically up in between them. And that is your best control for bunch rot right there. They found with all the sprays you can put on, nothing competes with just getting good air movement in those vines. So that's called vertical shoot positioning, or VSP. Quadrilateral cordon, table grapes. This is done in some wine grapes as well. I think the wine grapes we were pruning, they did it. If it's a real vigorous vineyard, you can do this. Instead of bilateral, instead of 2 arms, you've got 4. So you almost have like 2 canopies in this type of training. And you can see that I mentioned that you want to have some type of cross arm up here, or some way to catch all that foliage and have it cascading over to protect your fruit. This would be the type of training that you want to do on something like a very vigorous flame seedless, but not Thompson. This is what you're going to want to do on Thompson Seedless. This is head training and cane pruning. And I'll tell you about the cane pruning in the next couple slides. But you can see this is quite a different system. It's a lot more complicated. You don't want to train vines, cane prune vines if you don't have to. What happens is instead of leaving the little 2-bud spurs, you leave a whole big long cane. You can see one there, 2, 3. Those are canes. Instead of leaving just a couple buds, you leave big long canes. These have to be tied down to the wire, so it requires an additional operation. You also have to come in the next year and remove them completely and replace them with other canes. So you also have to leave some spurs down here and think about renewing the canes. So that's a real quickie on cane pruning. I'll show you a little bit more about it, but it's not nearly as simple as spur pruning. Spur pruning is what I show here. Pruning is really simple in grapevines because they only produce fruit on 1-year-old wood. And I showed you this out in the field. The grapes are very nice in that they show you what the 1-year-old wood is. It looks very, very different from the older wood. The 1-year-old wood is smooth. It's nice and brown and lignified and woody, but it doesn't have this rough, shaggy bark that you see on the rest of the wood. Generally, you want to leave somewhere between 30 and 60 buds on a vine. And that's a huge range, I realize, but we've got some vines that are quite small and that are quite close together, and then you have some vines that are quite large. I guess a better way to phrase it might be, you know, if your spurs are about this far apart, you're probably going to want to leave like what? That's about what, 7 inches? So maybe you're going to have 4 buds per foot, something like that you could use as a calculation. And you can see spur pruning is pretty simple. Once you develop the system, once you've got the vines up, all you have to do is come back in here, and it would be really easy to come in and make a spur pruning cut on here. You've had this shoot that grew last year, this shoot, you just come in and lop them off and you got your spurs. And just more detail here, this is a 2-bud spur, 1, 2, and you're going to leave anywhere from 10 to 16 spurs on a vine. It varies. And there's a diagram of these different pruning types on the bottom of your page there. Spur pruning, as you can see, as I said, it's just like once you've got the system in place, it's just plunk, 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 plunk. You can go in and make the cuts, and it's nice and easy, as opposed to the cane pruning that I showed you here. Now, canes, the wood is no different. It's still just 1-year-old wood, same 1-year-old wood, but instead of leaving 2 buds, a cane is just 10 to 14 buds. Instead of cutting it all the way back, you leave it longer. And it has to be tied on the wire, like I said. Do you leave more, I asked you this is a quiz question. Do you leave more buds then on a cane prune vine? Not necessarily. You might if you need to, but no, if you just left 2 canes, you're just going to have, what, 20 buds. If you put 8 canes on there on your Crimson Seedless, then you're going to have, you know, 80, 90 buds. So it really depends. You are able to leave a lot more buds on cane pruning if you need to. Okay, so when do you cane prune? You cane prune certain varieties, Thompson Seedless and Concords, because they don't produce fruit on those very bottom buds. So you have to cane prune them that way. Now, if you spur prune, you're going to say, wait a minute, I get some fruit. You will get some, but you'll never get a consistent amount of fruit, and you won't get the amounts that you would get if you cane prune. So Thompsons and Concords are the only varieties that you have to cane prune. Pinot Noir, people choose to cane prune because it's got teeny tiny little bunches, and in order to get that bud number up, like we were talking about, you have to leave the canes on there, so you can just leave so many more buds and get so many more little tiny clusters. What else about cane pruning? You have to be very careful in cane pruning to resist the temptation to leave really long canes. And I mentioned this, I think, when in the demo. Don't take them past 14 buds. You don't have enough carbohydrate nutrition to support those, and you've got that apical dominance effect. So what's going to happen is you're going to get them growing way out at the end out here. You'll get them growing back at the base and nothing in between. So you really do need to leave them at 10 to 14 buds. Training grapevines. Okay, so how do you get a vine up to those nice trunks that we showed there? And I'm going to give you the 5-second explanation on this. We do whole classes on this if you're a commercial grower. Generally, you're going to plant the vine and you're just going to let it grow like a little bush in the first year. Then you're going to prune it back to 2 buds, like a 2-bud spur. Right down here at the bottom, you're going to be broken-hearted that you're going to cut all that growth off of it, but you're going to cut it back to 2 buds, and then you're just going to have 2 shoots that are going to grow out very nicely. And what you want to do is just train one of those shoots right up the stake. Train it right up the stake. You leave the other one on as insurance. When the vine gets up to the top, you can lop that one off. Once it gets up past your wire where you're going to tie it down, you top it. And because you're topping it, you've eliminated that apical dominance effect. Remember how that works? And you stimulate laterals that are going to grow, and you're going to get these branches coming out the side here. And that's how you develop your cordon. Very simple. In the next year, you do have to come in and do a lot of thinning that I talked about before. Shoot suckering, crown suckering, they sometimes call this. You can see that this has got a lot more growth on it than those nice old vines that I was showing you. So basically, you would come in on a young vine and you'd pull all this junk off the bottom. You'd also take everything off of here except one shoot, and that will become your future spur. And a vine this age could not support all the fruit that they put on it. In year 3, they can make 10, 15 times the amount of fruit that they could actually support. So you're taking all that off as well. So that sort of leads us into just a quick review about the cycle of growth in a grapevine. And I want to show you what happens. This is the vegetative cycle of growth, just looking at the foliage and the woody parts of the plants. Your buds start growing in the springtime right about now. You can see them emerging. You see the shoot coming out. And you can see here that you've got leaves, and you've got the little flower clusters and a shoot tip there. They continue to grow through the season. Looks like this. Later in the season, they turn yellow and begin to senesce. The wood starts to get lignified and brown, and then you're back to the dormant season. That's all there is to the vegetative cycle. The grape, I showed you this bud earlier and talked about it being a compound bud. It's also compound in another way. Absolutely everything is contained in a single bud. The shoots, you saw it emerged with the shoot and the fruit and the tendrils and everything. You don't have fruit buds and leaf buds on a grapevine. It's all right in there. So if those buds get damaged, you lose everything. Now we're going to look at the reproductive cycle on the vines, and this is, of course, the part that we're interested in, and it's also the part that's a little bit more complicated. Remember back I showed you that your shoot was growing, right? Well, here's a close-up of the shoot, and what do you have right there? What are those? Clusters? Clusters of grapes? No, flower clusters. They're not fruit yet. Those are little clusters of flowers. About a month later, you'll get to this stage here called bloom, when all the little flowers open. And here's a close-up of what grapes look like when they open. Unlike other flowers, they don't open up like that. The top opens up, the cap opens up and falls off. So you don't be startled when you go out there and you see all this junk falling off of your little grapes. It's just these little petals falling off. They expose the flower parts, typical flower parts. They're pollinated, fertilized, and they turn into small berries. They go through a phase where they grow very, very quickly, expand in size in the middle of summer. And then very quickly they stop expanding in size and they start a phase of ripening, and they start developing color and sugar. And then we have ripe fruit that you see here. Fruit, I showed you that the fruit is formed in that bud. That fruit is formed the year before. So back while all that whole cycle is going on and you're developing fruit in that vine, the fruit for next year is deep down inside the bud developing for the next year. Does that make sense? So really, you've got 2 different things going on in a reproductive cycle in grapevines in a single year. Fertilization, again, this is another really easy topic because grapevines really don't need a whole lot of nutrients. You're more apt to get in problems by over-fertilizing vines than under-fertilizing, even in our poor soils. What they might need, if anything at all, is a little bit of nitrogen. Generally, they're not going to need this every year. Probably every 3 or 4 years, you could put on some nitrogen, very low rates. If you look in the Master Gardener in your chapter, it has the rates written in there. It depends on the formulation that you use. You want to put it on in late spring. That's the best time to put it on. Put it on when they're actively growing and they'll take up the nitrogen. You don't want to put it on during the dormant season because you're going to wind up washing it down past the root zone of those vines, and we don't like to leach nitrogen, nitrogen down potentially into groundwater. You also don't want to put on nitrogen late in the season when they've started that ripening. When they've started softening up and accumulating sugar and turning red, don't put on any nitrogen, because at that time the fruit is a very strong sink and it'll pull all the nitrogen into it, and it won't help the vine grow, and it will delay ripening and it'll make them rot. So you don't want to do it then. The other nutrients that you might consider putting on are micronutrients, zinc and boron. Zinc, and boron deficiency both look quite similar to this. So if you have some kind of problem with straggly bunches, then you might want to consider putting on zinc and boron. You don't need to if you're not seeing a problem. I don't see zinc problems very often. I do see boron problems. And more growers commercially are putting on boron. The problem with boron is that there's a very narrow range that grapevines need. If you have so many parts per million, 1 part per million, you're deficient. If you have 3 parts per million, you're toxic, and you can blow all your crop off. So you want to be very particular about putting it on if you need it. So I would say if you don't see problems like this, or if sometimes there are leaf problems as well, but unless you're seeing symptoms, don't try to correct a lot of problems in grapevines. People feel better if they put on potassium and phosphorus when they plant grapevines. I've been doing some research, and it doesn't seem to make any difference in the way they grow, at least in the first couple years. I'm going to watch it down the road and see what happens, since it's hard to get potassium and hard to get phosphorus down to the roots. But generally, you don't need to do too much of this. Any questions on fertilization? Anything else on fertilization? One thing I should mention, I said nitrogen. Nitrogen, you want to apply it to the roots. You want to apply it to the roots, not to the foliage. Grapevines take up about 100 times more nitrogen in their roots than they do the foliage. Watering grapevines. This is a fairly complicated subject, but I've summarized it down to a single slide because it takes a lot of sophisticated technology to figure out what you're doing. So what you want to do is seat of the pants, which is the way every commercial grape grower does it anyway. And once again, really grapevines have a pretty low water consumption rate compared to a lot of other crops. Wine grapes, as I mentioned before, are going to need a lot less water than table grapes. Think about those big fat berries. They're full of water. That's what's in there. So that is one thing that you have to keep in mind. Drip system works very, very well for grapevines. You're delivering the water right to the roots. It works very efficiently. You don't need to use micro sprinklers like you might want to use in trees. It just works great, and it's easy to maintain. Here's my Master Gardener rule of thumb for watering. Water every 2 weeks for table grapes and less for wine, maybe once a month if they need it. However, you've got to keep in mind that that's very dependent on your soils. And I'll show you a slide in just, I think the next slide I'll mention it a little bit more. And you want to watch for water stress in your vines. Signs of water stress, the leaves will droop just a very slight bit. They're not going to droop like a lot of other trees and tomatoes. They don't look like that. Just the angle of the leaf will change very slightly. And the other thing you can look at if you're trying to diagnose a problem and you think it might be water related is the status of the tendrils. If you've got a shoot that somebody's brought into you and all the tendrils are dried up, that means there was some pretty severe water stress at some point in time when the tendrils are all dry. I mentioned that I can't tell you exactly when to irrigate because it's so dependent on those soils, like I told you, how deep they are and what the soil content is. In a clay soil, this is what the pattern would look like with 2 drippers. In a sandy soil, it would look something like this. So the best clue if you're talking to somebody and trying to give them advice is tell them to get out there with a shovel, really, until if they really want to know how to water them, it really helps to know how after like 8 hours after an irrigation, where is your water? If they could dig a hole and take a look and see where the water is. If not, they're going to have to go back to the Donna Hirschfeld rule of water every 2 weeks or once a month. But if that's about as precise as they need to be. You need to remember where the roots are going to be, though, too. You're planting a real tiny little vine, perhaps one of these green growing plants I told you about that's just in a little sleeve. That's like growing a house plant. Think about your roots. They're just in that top foot of soil. You don't want to put on 8 gallons of water and then wait a week and put on another 8 gallons. I've heard old timers talk about this. Let's make the roots go down. We want to make the roots go down there. Well, yes, to some extent, roots will grow towards that interface of where there's water. But they're not thinking, knowing creatures that are going to say, I bet you there's water down there like 4 more feet and I really could use it. So, think about that. You really have to have the water right past them if you're going to try to use that technique. I've seen vines that are water stressed in these young plants, and the guy will say, I put on, 24-hour set just last week. How could they be water stressed? Well, because it's completely dry around the roots, and right down there about 10 feet below, you've got this great pool of water. So keep that in mind. Where are your roots?
What about grass around the base of the trunk or putting mulch around the base?
What about grass around the base of the trunk, and what about mulch? Well, two opposite things would happen there. I don't talk very much about weeds in this talk, but I sure do to commercial growers. If you have grass growing up next to a vine, it is going to take up a lot of the water, and it can be very, very competitive, believe it or not, especially if the roots are down in about the same area as those vines. In young vines, it's critical if you want good growth to get those weeds, get that grass out of there. Mulch, on the other hand, mulch can be very effective to retain moisture, but it's hard to do. You need to have about 3 or 4 inches on there all the time. So it means putting stuff on and putting it on and putting it on, and it decomposes pretty quickly. Question behind you?
When you try to irrigate, you see some vines look like they're not irrigated at all.
Mm-hmm.
Do they not irrigate vines? I've heard that.
Okay, the question is, are there some vines that are not irrigated at all? Dry land grapes, and back in California many years ago, yes. There are certainly places that you can grow grapes without water, but you can only grow certain varieties. You can't have very much crop. Zinfandel, those little head-trained Zinfandels, and some old vineyards in Napa Valley. And the third thing, and this is a mistake that new grape growers make, I want to be like these old vineyards. I want to have dry land grapes. Those are planted in the prime spots. That's the place where they have 10 or 15 feet of soil. And you can't do that up on the hillside that's left where you can still buy some land. So it really is dependent on your soil. But yeah, you can. In some years, they can be pretty drought stressed. So it's really dependent. You have a lot more fluctuations in your yield and the way the vines perform. And again, you have to keep the crop down really low. The question was, I put the grapes on a trellis around my yard, around my garden. I think it's too wet most of the time. That happens a lot. When you see grapes in association with a lawn, typically it's overwatered. And my bet is you've got tons of vegetative growth, tons of foliage, shoots that are really long. They go on and on forever, but not a lot of fruit. And what happens then is you get a vine that gets sort of into a vegetative cycle. That's all it does, because it produces a lot of shade, so it's not very fruitful, and it's very hard to break that cycle. There's not much you can do if you've got too much water. Another question in the back. How far out do the roots grow? It's tremendously variable depending on the soil and the water. They tend to be, grapes they're kind of lazy roots. If they don't have to, if the water source is right there, they'll sort of really stay where the water is. They won't grow out feet and feet and feet. But if you furrow or irrigate them, or you flood irrigate them, there will be roots that'll go out 8 feet around the vines and down. They'll go down 15 feet and more. They'll go down for water. Any other questions about water soils? We'll get on to pests, and then we'll talk about table grape practices. Pest management in grapes. A very, very interesting situation. We have a couple problems that are huge that you'll always have to deal with, and then we have just a whole lot of incidental problems that you may see or you may not, and it's really just best to deal with them as they occur. I could have shown you 70 slides of things that might happen in a vineyard, but I want to focus on the ones that are always problems and that you'll always get questions about. Biggest problem in grapevines is powdery mildew. And I know you've heard about this in your plant pathology class and in other crops, but it is a different fungus. It's very specific, only grows on grapevines. Uncinula nicator is the powdery mildew fungus. You can see very typical symptoms of severe powdery mildew here. That's been on there for probably 2 months at least. Gets the powdery appearance from all the little chains of spores that you see here. You can see just like, and the important thing about this disease, it's very interesting. It's not like a lot of fungi. It's not, when you think about fungus, you think of wet, humid, moist. This fungus grows beautifully in dry conditions. It does great from 0 to 99% relative humidity. What drives it completely, or almost completely, is temperature. It loves temperatures between about 70 and 85 degrees. So figure, if you're comfortable, mildew is growing. I say it's our biggest problem. Why? Because California has this wonderful climate, right? We always have temperatures between 70 and 85 degrees. Even if we get quite warm, we've got good temperatures at night. So just expect that virtually every vine or every vineyard is going to be treated for powdery mildew. Now you'll run into people and they'll say, well, I don't ever treat for powdery mildew and I do okay. They may. But they may also think that their grapes are shriveling because of lack of water or for some other reason that could be attributed to powdery mildew. The other thing is that there are big varietal differences in powdery mildew. If you really don't want to have to control powdery mildew, Don't plant certain varieties. Don't plant Chardonnay. Don't plant Cabernet. Don't plant Thompson Seedless is sort of moderate. There's another variety called Ruby Seedless that's impossible to grow if you don't control the powdery mildew. Some that are not too susceptible, Flames are not quite as bad. Zinfandel is just moderate, so you don't have to worry quite as much as with Cabernet. I always show this slide whenever I give a powdery mildew talk, because this is the take-home message. It's the most important thing on control. Powdery mildew control has to be preventative for two reasons. First of all, that's the way that materials work, by preventing spore germination, all those little spores that you saw. The other thing is you can't spot early problems. Those little spores that I showed you in the last slide can go, if the temperature is optimal, they can go from a spore blowing and landing on a leaf and infecting to developing a new chain of spores in 5 days. So you can go from nothing to an epidemic in a week. This leaf has a lot of powdery mildew on it. That's, you can't spot it. There's a little bit right there. This is not. You're thinking that that's probably the first thing that catches your eye. But look, there's a little bit right there. When I have people look for powdery mildew, I always tell them to do this. Generally, at first, you want to look on the underside of the leaf. Later in the season, you can look at the upper surface. But always look at an angle like this. See how, if you look at it straight on, it's much harder to see than if you tip it on its side, like you can see here. And I think it helps to get it out of the direct sun, believe it or not, too. I can almost see more if you're in indirect light or in a shady part of the vine. So that's what powdery looks like when it's a little bit more advanced. Later in the season, you'll see the powdery mildew fungus on the fruit, and you'll often see these little bodies as well, and they start out yellow, and then they turn orange, and then brown, and then black. And those are called cleistothecia. It's the sexual stage of the fungus. We don't know how important it is. We do know that it can be part of the overwintering source of powdery mildew for the next season. But we almost, if you've got a bad enough infestation, generally you're going to have this problem. Whether or not you look for it, probably not. But it's just an odd thing that you might see and you might mistake for some type of insect frass or something else. This is just the last sign or symptom that I'll show you. If you had a little bit of mildew in the season, you'll notice it on the canes, on the wood when you're pruning, and it looks like this kind of burgundy, maroonish blotchiness on the wood. Not the little black spots. Everybody sees these little spots, and they think those might be spores or something of the powdery mildew, and they're not. But this staining indicates that there was some damage on the wood. Do you want to prune that out? Not particularly, but it's probably a sign to you that you need to be a little bit more diligent next year. I think the next slide does talk about control. I mentioned that it needs to be preventative. The thing that we most commonly use, especially in non-commercial settings, is sulfur. And you can use sulfur either as a dust or as a spray. As a dust, it's quite effective. It moves into the vine. You can buy little belly grinder dusters. There are some if you have more than a few vines, there are some backpacks with an engine that you can blow sulfur dust in. It distributes itself very well. The way that sulfur works is that it has to be present on all parts of the vine. All of the green tissue has to be covered with sulfur, which means you have to apply it over and over and over again. That can also pose problems with putting on a sulfur spray, which is generally easier for backyard folks to do because you don't want to be out there with this duster. The other thing I didn't mention about the sulfur dust is it's stinky, it burns your eyes, you don't want to do it if you don't have to. Sprays are a lot easier to do, but then you have to get very good coverage. You have to be very cautious that you're getting all of the foliage covered. Both of these can wash off if you get rainfall. So you've got to go back and put it right back on if you get any rainfall. When do you sulfur? This is another question that you're going to get a lot because people say, well, I sulfured. I sulfured my grapevines, and I still got powdery mildew last year. How many times did you sulfur them? Well, 2. Well, 3? No, it was 2. Well, that's not enough. With grapes, you have to start when they're out a couple inches, and you start at that point in time at no later than, say, 4 inches, and then you want to put a sulfur application on every 7 to 14 days, all through the summer until it gets over 100 degrees for like a week, or until they start ripening, until they start coloring up and accumulating sugar, so into August. So, yes?
What's 2 inches?
The shoot growth, I'm sorry, till the little shoots that are coming out, because you've got to protect the shoots, the little shoots, and the fruit. So you're going to start when you got little shoots that are out here. When they're all out, you put on a wettable spray or a dust application, and then every 7 days or 14 days. Commercial table grapes, they'll put on 15 sulfur applications in a season. Balaton is about the only other fungicide that is effective and available to backyard grape growers. Balaton is a systemic fungicide. It's absorbed into the plant material so it doesn't wash off. It can also protect for a few days longer than sulfur, but not for a long time. And we do have some instances where powdery mildew is resistant to it. But I'll tell you, if you're not adverse to using an inorganic fungicide, it's a good material, it'll save you a little bit of time, and it won't be as stinky. Sulfur can be very, very disruptive to your pest management program. You'll have more problems with spider mites if you use sulfur than if you use Balaton. So it's sort of one of those things you have to balance. You can get organic sulfur, so if you want to be organic and you want to use that, that's the way to go. But if the Balaton, you can throw in a spray or two, it might help you. Especially if you have a problem, the grower hasn't, or the backyard person hasn't been able to control the powdery mildew, you might want to consider it. Oh, you know what? I think I skipped a slide here. I remembered it was in the wrong spot, but I'll get to your question about the sulfur burn. What was the other question first?
Question on the application of the Balaton. How long before harvest?
How long before harvest on the Balaton? I can't recall what the pre-harvest interval is, but generally you're not going to want to put those on after they start ripening anyway. After the grapes get about 10% sugar, the fruit is not susceptible to mildew anymore. So once you start getting sugar and color on them, you don't need to worry about the fruit. Your leaves might still look really, really bad, but you probably don't have to put an application on. So a lot of times people won't put on sulfur and they won't put on any kind of other materials from, say, mid-August to harvest. It's sort of just a general rule. I think it got out of, I think it's one that my daughter rearranged the order on, but sulfur can cause burn, getting back to her question first, and then I'll answer your question. You do want to be careful with sulfur. If you've used oil in your tank as well, oil and sulfur can cause burn to the foliage, and I'll show you a slide, I think, in a minute or two of what sulfur burn looks like. Most of the time it doesn't matter when you put on the sulfur, but if temperatures are going to get into the 90s, up into 100, you probably want to put them on as late in the day as possible, right before dark, so that you have that time for it to cool off in the evening. And the other part that I wanted to talk about control before we get on to bunch rot is eradication, like you were asking about, Elizabeth. What if you get powdery mildew? What if you have a problem? Then what, Donna? You kept talking about prevention. If you have to eradicate powdery mildew, it is very difficult. The only thing you can do is lots of water and sulfur, huge gallonages. You just hose, you literally wash off the vines and wash the fruit. Back when I was in college, 25 years ago, I was working in a plot up in Camino, and we were watching individual bunches of Chardonnay with a hose and with wettable sulfur. And even if you do that, you may stop the mildew from growing, but you're still going to have very scarred fruit. The damage will be there. So once you get in a situation where you have a problem, no, it's very hard. Lots of water, sulfur, maybe a little bit of surfactant or a little soap added. Do you want to put on a dormant spray to help? No. You notice I didn't say anything about dormant sprays. We don't recommend them. Lime sulfur is not a material I like to use in grapevines. It's really not as innocuous a material as people make it out to be, and it's not very effective. So I don't suggest people use it. Any other questions about powdery mildew control? Yes.
The combination, would there be any advantage to using the Balaton with the sulfur?
The question is there an advantage in using a combination of Balaton and sulfur? Yes, you could be a commercial grower. That's what they do. Yeah, you can combine them or you could alternate them, and that works very well.
I just want one good vine.
You want one good vine. There's somebody that's growing a grapevine. See, they know about the powdery mildew. Yeah, you could combine them, but most importantly, don't stretch those intervals out past about 10 days. Question in the back?
If I had it last year, do I have it this year?
If you have it last year, do you have it this year? What's your weather going to be like in June? If you can tell me that, then I'll tell you. Sometimes it's a good indicator that you're going to have a problem. You've got the inoculum out there, right? But it really is dependent on climate. The other thing, two things that kill the fungus, oddly enough, water, which is why the washing works so well. So sprinkler irrigation seems to help, overhead sprinklers, although you don't want it because of other problems. But sprinklers work, hosing them down. Rainfall, in fact, is sort of a, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's good. It can wash mildew off, but the problem is you tend to have cloudy, cool days that are fairly conducive as well. So it's hard to predict. The other thing that kills those little delicate spores is sunlight. So if we have a nice hot spring and you've got a lot of sun bearing down on nice open canopies before your vines get real dense, then you'll get some control of the powdery mildew just from the heat and the sunlight. So you have to really kind of watch the climate. But in general, if you've had problems, you're probably going to continue to have them. Any other powdery mildew questions? Yes?
Just the baking soda, if you're going to use that instead, what do you do?
Baking soda instead? You know, I would look, and I'm trying to think if we do, I think we do have that in some recommendations, of some of the UC recommendations. So I'd look and see, I can't remember, it's a couple ounces. But again, the key is it's just about the same frequency. Okay, bunch rot. This is our next disease, a fungal disease. And this is a problem in some years and not others in the foothills. This happens to be a Chenin Blanc vine. It's supposed to be a white grape, like you see here. And this is all bunch rot. There are actually two different kinds of bunch rots here. This is Botrytis bunch rot, Botrytis cinerea, the classic bunch rot of the noble wines of France. You know, the Sauternes, the dessert wines that are made from botrytized grapes, or the Beerenauslesers or Trockenbeerenauslesers from Germany. They're made from fruit that's got this type of rot. And what happens is this Botrytis cinerea attacks the skins, and it sort of weakens the skins. It makes them very thin, so the grape can desiccate and raisin down and become very concentrated and get these very high sugars and very strong aromatic kind of fruity, apricot-y kind of flowery flavors to them. So yes, they make Sauternes out of fruit that looks like this. But in general, people don't want even this type of fruit when they're making wines, because you do get a lot of spores. It imparts certain flavors. Problem more in tight clustered varieties. As I said, this is Chenin Blanc. That's a tight clustered variety. Our biggest problem in the foothills is with Zinfandel. This is the sulfur burn. This is that we were talking about, applying sulfur. Generally, you're not going to see burn on the fruit. Occasionally, if you really overdose them with sulfur and it gets very hot, you will. But this is most frequently what you'll see. And you might have someone that brings this into you, a sample. It's just out on the very delicate shoot tips. This is the most sensitive part of the grapevine, so you'll see a little bit of crispiness right out there on the smallest leaves. That's sulfur burn. Pierce's disease. Okay, we've got to talk about Pierce's disease. It's the big news in California, but do we really need to talk about Pierce's disease? We don't have it. We don't have this in El Dorado County. We don't in Amador. I don't think we do in Placer, but I couldn't swear on it in Placer. Caused by a bacterium, Xylella fastidiosa. That's probably not critical for you to know. There's plenty written up about this. The problem with this disease is that it's a killer of grapevines. Very few things will kill grapevines. They're very, very hardy. Most things just weaken them and debilitate them, and it'll take 20, 30 years to kill them. This can kill a grapevine in a year. What happens is the bacteria gets into the xylem, into the water-conducting vessels of the vine, clogs them up, probably produces some toxins, and the vine really looks like it's water stressed. Looks a little bit different in red varieties than it does in white varieties. You have to be careful looking at these leaf symptoms and getting very panicky, because we have other things that look like this. Some of the nutritional problems can look like Pierce's disease, and we have a disease called Spanish measles that looks somewhat like this. And I couldn't find a slide scanned in to put in, so I don't have Spanish measles to show you, but it's in the Grape Pest Management book, so I want you to look at that when you get a chance in the library. Pierce's disease is not new to California. It's been around for 150 years. Before it was called Pierce's disease, it was called Anaheim disease, because it wiped out all the vineyards in Anaheim and all the rest of Southern California. When you think back about the history, all of our early vineyards were surrounding the missions, and the biggest industry developed in Southern California. The vines all died from this mystery disease, and it was this Pierce's disease. So it's not new. This is not a new thing. It has become a significantly greater problem in recent years, even before all this news about glassy wing. It's been getting worse and worse and worse in the North Coast. in Napus and Sonoma. And there are a variety of reasons for this. We're planting varieties that are very susceptible to it. We're planting vineyards all over. There's a monoculture of vineyards. We have a lot of hosts for the bacterium. We have a lot of ornamental plants in both of those areas that are also hosts. The roses, all those people putting in the roses, great host for, you know, this one, it's a great host for that. It is vectored by an insect, a sharpshooter leafhopper. This happens to be the new one, the glassy wing sharpshooter, that you're reading all about in the newspaper and you can hear about on the news. Glassy wing sharpshooter. This is a relatively new pest to California. It's been here for 10 years, 11 years now. Was first found down around Ventura, again in the southern part of the state. What happens is any of the sharpshooters can feed on a host plant that has the bacterium in it, and there are many, many weeds that will have this Xylella bacterium in it. Then they get that in their piercing mouth parts, and then they'll fly to a vine and infect it. It has to be vectored by one of these insects, not this particular one, but by a sharpshooter. Not a leafhopper. Grape leafhoppers and some of the other leafhoppers won't spread it, but other sharpshooters will as well. So way before this became a concern in California, as I said, we started seeing more and more problems in the North Coast. That was because we had an abundance of, I think it's in the next slide, we had an abundance of this little sharpshooter here. This is, I think, the blue-green sharpshooter. And this is very common all over Northern California. I have not seen them in Amador County, and I have not seen them in El Dorado, although I haven't looked as widely. But this is the vector that is of primary concern in most of our grape growing areas. The glassy wing sharpshooter is a vector only when you get in the southern parts of California right now, and now a problem in Kern County. An important thing, notice the difference in these insects. Huge difference in size between these. And a grape leafhopper, if you're familiar with a grape leafhopper, it would be about half the size of this. So this is a big, big insect relative to the other ones. I have one glassy wing that I brought along with me if you want to take a look at it when we finish up here. It looks more like a psyllid, really, than a lot of the other insects, but very distinctive looking. We have a lot of materials that you'll be able to use in your library on Pierce's disease and on glassy wing. There are brochures on glassy wing that you can give to people. If you suspect that you might have a glassy wing at all, you want to give it to me or give it to Lynn, and we'll talk with the Ag Commissioner's office about what we're seeing, and we'll get it properly identified. Very likely, you would see a glassy wing sharpshooter before a grape grower would. This pest is not likely to be showing up in vineyards in our area. It's going to show up in ornamentals. And the problem is that, as I mentioned, it's now established in Southern California, and pretty widely established in Southern California, where a lot of our ornamental nurseries are. And while right now there are all kinds of quarantine parameters in effect, they have to spray a lot of plant material before it comes out of these areas. They're inspecting plants at all the nurseries when you come into all of our counties. The Agricultural Commissioner's Office is checking all the plants in the nurseries that come into the Walmarts and the Kmarts and the nurseries. But that is where they're finding glassy wing. And sometimes they find the adults, sometimes they find the egg masses. It just depends. So it's not necessarily going to show up in grapevines. Is it a pest on its own? Not particularly, except that it does excrete a lot of liquid, very much like aphids with the honeydew. It has to pump so much liquid through its body to get any nutrients that it can excrete some fluid. But generally, it's not much of a pest. It just makes things look a little whitewashed. It, unlike many of these other sharpshooters, is a xylem feeder. And if you stop and think about that, remember in the plant the phloem is under normal pressure, but the xylem is under negative pressure, right? Because you've got this negative pressure pulling the water. So it's got amazingly strong mouth parts that it can go into a grapevine and it can extract out water. It's got this enormous head and just an amazing jaw to be able to do what it can do. It is a potent and a devastating transmitter of the Pierce's disease. So what's the catch? You really have to have the vector and you have to have the bacterium present before you have a problem. And we don't seem to have either. In places in the United States where they have glassy wing sharpshooter, and they have had it for a long time, it's primarily in warmer areas. There seems to be some type of association with warm areas. It doesn't seem to go to higher elevations. In the southeastern part of the United States, they don't see it moving up into the mountains. It's down in the lower areas. It causes a disease. Xylella and glassy wing can spread a disease called phony peach in Georgia, but they don't have it above a certain elevation at all. So we might be protected in that way. There seem to be other things that are limiting its establishment. Because if you stop and think about it, I said it's been here for 10 years and it's moving on these ornamentals and they're finding it. They found it in Rancho Cordova the last year, remember? Well, it's been happening probably all along. It's been moving. I mean, it's just now we're really looking for it. It's not like all of a sudden last year it just decided to be spreading itself. So again, that might be a positive sign that for some reason it's not going to get very well established in California. However, we can't take that chance. If it got established in the North Coast, in Napa and Sonoma, the losses would be absolutely tremendous. And so, you know, there's just all these quarantines in place. People are concerned about movement of plants. People are concerned about even movement of wine grapes, movement of fruit. And now, the latest is concerned about moving table grapes, and the Australians have a quarantine on California table fruit going to Australia. All because of this guy right here. What else about Pierce's disease? And let me see if I have another slide in here. I do have some more pictures of symptoms. Okay, so I said that the leaf symptoms really look a lot like other things, nutrition and measles. But you can look for some of these other characteristic symptoms. Look, this is a shoot towards the end of the season, and you can see it's woody here, but it's green here. And for some reason, this happens very often with this disease, almost always. You get these irregular maturity, blotches, green, then mature, green, then mature. And then this only happens with Pierce's disease. You have the petiole, the stem of the leaf stays on, but the blade, the leaf falls off. So you get this funny looking shoot with all these little sprouts coming off of it. Those are the petioles of the leaf. I think this is just another shot. You can see that very clearly, and you can also see what it does to the fruit. Basically just raisins it on the vine. It tends to happen a little bit earlier in the season. That is not sweet raisiny fruit. It's dry and crispy, and there's no sugar in it. Shoot growth is stunted, and in the next year that vine would be dead. So that was everything I had on Pierce's disease and Xylella and glassy wing. Any questions on glassy wing or PD? You'll hear it called PD too.
Does it ever harm other plants?
Does it ever harm plants? Good question. Does it harm other plants? Yes. And now that there's this big concern about it, we're finding out more and more. The Xylella bacterium that goes to grapes seems to be present in many, many weeds, but doesn't cause a problem. Xylella also goes to some trees. It goes to alfalfa, almonds, oleander. There's a new disease called oleander leaf scourge. And initially we thought, oh boy, that's a nightmare. If that's the same bacterium as Pierce's disease, it's going to move right up 99 and just spread all over. Turns out it's a different strain of the bacteria. So there are differences in it. And we're finding out more and more every day. But yeah, there is a wide host range for the Pierce's disease bacterium. Roses are a good host. There's also a huge host range for the glassy wing sharpshooter. They'll feed on just about anything. So it gets really complicated when you start looking at all the lists of what's susceptible, list of what's a host, and it can be confusing. But yeah, you can see this in other things. Oh, one important thing that we discovered last year, Scott Oneto, that you've met, who coordinates the Master Gardener program in Amador County, saw a bunch of maple leaves that were scorched. Master gardeners were getting phone calls about it up in the high country in Amador County. So he collected samples, and we sent them off to the state lab, and they came back positive for Xylella, for the Pierce's disease bacterium. And so we were very concerned. But it turned out that in some instances, they were getting some false positives because the method they use is so precise that they can detect even a fragment of DNA of this bacterium. So they were having some lab problems. Anyway, we took those same samples and we resubmitted them in multiples to different places. And we also sent them to UC Davis to the lab, and they came back negative. And this was after the professor that looked at him says, I'm positive that's Xylella. We have maple leaves that scorch like that in the Bay Area. It's Xylella. I'm positive. And they came back negative. He was so shocked that he had Scott take many, many more samples. So we've done a broad sampling of maple trees in the high country, and it doesn't seem to be the same bacterium as causing the problem in maples in other parts of the state, and not the same as the grapes. So very complicated, and I don't think we know all the answers yet. But hopefully that's true with the maples that are showing the scorch up on 50 too. Oak trees, I just had to throw this in very quickly, isn't really a picture of oak root fungus. We do occasionally run into oak root fungus in vines in the foothills, as you would well expect. But that's probably not the biggest problem with oak trees. They just tend to be very, very competitive, as you all know. That they're competitive with grapevines just like with everything else. And this shows a grower who made a valiant effort to leave the oak trees in. But if you look at these vines and how weak these were here, and this vine came over here, it's hard to see, but they're so much weaker than the vines back in here. So it's very difficult to have vines and oak trees coexist in very close proximity. Certainly, you can leave them in the vineyard. We recommend that you leave some in the vineyard, but they do pose a lot of problems, and you're probably going to have to take an awful lot of them out. Phylloxera. I mentioned that we plant all of our grapevines on resistant rootstock, and you were asking about resistant rootstock. Way back before Glassy wing sharpshooter was famous, this little insect was on the front page of the New York Times and the Chronicle and every place else. Phylloxera is a very small insect that I'll show you in the next slide that has the other distinction of being one of the few things that will kill grapevines dead. And it also is not a new problem. And it has an interesting and amazing history. I mentioned the Concords and that there were these species of grapes from the United States. Well, it turns out that Phylloxera, this little root louse, is native to the East Coast. And back in the early days when Jefferson was interested in wine and people were growing vineyards back there, they were bringing all this wood in from France, and people probably saw these interesting Concords and thought they had this different taste. And so they were shipping stuff back to Europe as well. Well, we gave the French Phylloxera. And I think it's the 1850s, our little insect wiped out virtually every vineyard in France. Well, then they got back at us by, of course, we weren't wise enough to bring wood from the East Coast to California. At the meantime, we're planting vineyards all over in California, and we were bringing wood from France, so we also brought the Phylloxera in from France to California. And so through this circuitous route, then it wound up killing all the vineyards in California back in the 1870s. So if you, in the foothills, you'll run into a lot of places where there were old vineyards and they're gone for some reason. Well, the reason they're gone is because of Phylloxera, most likely. Could be cold, but most likely it was Phylloxera that got in there and killed them. This is what the disease the insect problem looks like in the field. They'll look like that for the first year, and then the second year they look dead, completely dead. This is what the pest looks like itself. However, you don't get a grasp of the size of it. It's just barely visible to the naked eye, visible with a 10-power hand lens quite easily if you start digging around on the roots. In California, we don't have any above-ground infestations of Phylloxera. There are winged forms that occur on the East Coast, but in California, it's this funny-looking little insect. Looks more like an aphid than anything, lives down on the roots. You never see it, you never know you have a problem with it until you start digging around, see these bright little lemon-colored critters on the roots, charred, blackened, dead roots, and then your vine is dead. So what do you do to control it? They tried for many years to do chemical-type treatments or something to control it. You can't get chemicals down into the roots. It's not environmentally sound, and there's no way to effectively get materials down in a root zone. Fortunately, we can control this very simply with resistant rootstocks. I mentioned that we have these other species that occur in the United States. Well, those co-evolved with the Phylloxera, a lot of them. So they were very used to having Phylloxera around. They're naturally resistant. So way back when this problem first happened in France, the French tried to breed them together. They'd say, okay, we'll take Pinot Noir and we'll cross it with this and we'll come up with this grape. Well, the problem was it never quite had the same flavor as Pinot Noir, as Cabernet Sauvignon, so these never caught on. They're called French hybrids, and they're still grown in some areas because of their resistance and because some are quite cold tolerant. But what they did discover is that if you grafted your scion wood, your Cabernet, your Zinfandel, your Chardonnay, onto one of these different species, then you would eliminate the problem altogether. You don't eliminate the problem, you've still got the insects in there, but you don't have any problem with it. So very simple solution. If you don't want to have phylloxera problems, you plant a resistant rootstock, a grafted vine. And there are a dozen different rootstocks that are available. They have different horticultural properties that people might choose from. If you need information on that, I can certainly help you. Should you guys be planting on your own roots or on a rootstock, or if somebody's planting a vine or two in their yard, probably doesn't matter. But if somebody's planting 400 vines and they really want the vineyard to be in there for 15 years or 20 years or for their kids, they probably should think about doing it. There is a cost difference in buying the plants. They're more expensive to buy a grafted vine, but it's the only way to ensure that you're not going to have a problem. This moves from vineyard to vineyard in a variety of ways, on tractors, on equipment, on people's feet, on truck tires. People will try to have quarantines. There is a quarantine in effect in El Dorado County about movement of plants in, and when they get wine grapes in, or grapes in, period, the Ag Commissioner's Office inspects them to make sure that the plants are clean. But historically, it's not been very successful to keep it out of a vineyard if you're going to have a lot of movement coming in. One thing that happens with a lot of wineries, you might say, I'm not bringing in, you know, anything from another vineyard. But then at picking time, you wind up bringing bins in maybe from the winery, and you don't know where those have been. So there's a lot of potential for infestation. I saw a question back here. Do you still have a question? Or that?
Wondering if you go to buy a vine, it's labeled as a phylloxera resistant.
You know, if you buy a vine, will it be labeled phylloxera resistant? If you buy it at, you know, most store nurseries, no, it won't. They won't even be grafted vines. You would specifically have to request a grafted vines. Some of the bigger nurseries do carry resistant vines, or you can special order them. There are many, obviously, many grape nurseries in the state, and they'll sell even just few vines to people. Anything else on phylloxera? I think that's my last slide on phylloxera. Spider mites is probably our biggest arthropod pests in grapevines in the foothills. Not an insect though, remember? Not an insect problem. More of a problem when we use sulfur dust. It's, some people think sulfur is going to control the mites, and that's not the case. But more the problem when you use sulfur dust, more of a problem if you have a dusty vineyard. So you'll notice that if your vines are right along a dirt road, they're going to have a problem. And more of a problem in certain varieties. Zinfandel is notorious for having spider mite problems. It's got dense little hairy leaves, and spider mites love tucking in those little hairs on the leaves. Thompson Seedless, on the other hand, has no hairs on its leaves, and mites don't like it very much up here. In the San Joaquin Valley they do, but it's a different spider mite. We have problems with Willamette mites. Best control, in backyard situations, generally you can use soapy water to control them. You can use water and oil can sometimes be effective. Safer soap is moderately effective. What else? You don't want to use some of the insecticides. Insecticides won't kill them. And some insecticides, like Sevin, never want to use Sevin. It blows up mites. It tends to encourage their populations. They seem to lay more eggs if you use Sevin. So you don't want to use Sevin on grapevines. What else about spider mites? The damage is primarily just yellowing of the leaves and crispy leaves. I don't think I threw a slide in there. I figured I'd be running out of time. Here is our biggest problem. Who knows what that is? Deer damage. Deer damage to grapevines. And there's only one solution. Deer fencing, and you'll notice that most commercial vineyards have deer fencing. If they don't, and they have deer around, you will not have any fruit. Most of you have tried the repellents and some of the different things, and you know how those work. It's just pretty marginal, if at all. And grapes love, deer love grapes. They don't just like the fruit. They like the foliage as well. They'll eat the shoots right off, so you won't even have a vine. I had a friend who has a commercial vineyard, and he was talking to me, and he goes, you know, this can't be right, but I think I lost like 20 tons of fruit just this year from my crop estimate. And I said, oh, well, you know, could you have deer problems out there? And he goes, you know, I was out there one night, we were hunting pigs, and yeah, there were about 30 or 40 deer out there. A ton apiece, that's not bad, you know. I think you know how, I'm surprised he had any vines. And you know, when I thought back on it, I recalled at dusk driving through that vineyard. It's like, aren't there a bunch of deer munching over there? So anyway, that's what happens when you take a San Joaquin Valley person and put them in the hills. Okay, birds are another significant problem in grapevines in the foothills. They're especially a problem if you don't have other things around. Red varieties are more of a problem than white. The earlier they ripen seems to be more of a problem. And again, really there's not too much you can do very effectively. Netting is your best bet. And on a small scale, it's quite effective. The degree that you have to net depends on the birds themselves. Starlings are fairly dumb, and they probably, if you just drape a net over, that'll be fine. Robins are pretty smart. Robins will try to get up in there and start plucking off berries. So you really have to know what bird is causing the problem. If it's the only red fruit, red sweet fruit around, you can bet that birds are going to find it and enjoy it. Table grape practices. This is my last slide. And I want to talk a little bit about some of these questions we had about producing table grapes. As I mentioned, the first thing that you have to do if you want to produce good table grapes is eliminate most of the crop. I would say that on a commercial table grape vine, if you're at what, say an 8-foot or a 6 or 8 foot by 10 foot spacing, you're probably only going to have something like 25 or 30 bunches. And if you think back in your mind of the size of the clusters or the bunches that you have at the grocery store, those things are what, a pound, pound and a half, couple pounds. So think about what that crop load is on that vine. Vines only have the capacity to ripen so much fruit. So if you're going to get those great big bunches, you're not going to be able to have many of them. So I say, what, 25 bunches on a table grape vine as opposed to a wine grape, which could have 100 bunches maybe. The most I've ever seen on a grapevine was in an experiment that I did with non-pruning, an Australian technique, and non-pruning little teeny bunches, and it had 714 bunches on the vine. But they were this big, you know, 8. We had to say, it's got to have 5 berries or it's not going to be considered a bunch. So, you know, you can have this, you can either have a lot of fruit or big berries. So that's the first thing that you need to do. Now, when do you want to go in and do this thinning? There are several different times that you're going to do this. First of all, I showed you the one slide where you've got the thinning and you're breaking off all the shoots there early in the season. That would be the first point where you're going to want to do thinning. You want to go through and just break off all the extra shoots that are in there that aren't your count shoots. You have your nice spur right there, right? You've got a spur with 2 buds. So you're going to get one shoot growing out there and another one growing out here. You want those 2 shoots. Any other junk kind of stuff that grows in the middle, take it off. Anything growing below, take it off. Leave very precise, nice shoots. And they do this in wine grapes as well. They do that part of it. You want nice fruit that's kind of neatly arranged, not all bunched together. The next thing you're going to want to do is if there are 2 shoots on, 2 bunches on a shoot, take one off. Never leave more than 1 on there. And that should bring you down to, say, something like 25 or 30 bunches. Okay? And you can do that very early in the season. You can get in there, it's very succulent. You can just pinch them off with your fingers. So that's the best way to do it. Then you're going to want to wait until bloom time or shortly after bloom. And I showed you those nice little yellow flowers that you can see. And then what you ought to do is go in and tip. I've talked a long time, haven't I? Tip the bottom of the bunches. You wouldn't top the bottom of the bunches. That wouldn't make any sense. Tip the bottom of the bunches. Just cut the bottom 1/3 to 1/2 off of the bunches. And it will seem like a lot. Again, it's going to look shocking to you, but it really isn't. So that would be the next thing that you would do. And probably for most of you, that is going to be the extent of what you're going to do for table grape practices. But I want to show you a couple other things that are done commercially and that if you really wanted to, you could do too if you want to be a table grape grower. I mentioned that the seeds produce the hormones that make the berries get large and plump. Well, the other way that we can produce them large and plump without the seeds is to spray the hormones on in a spray solution. And that's what's done commercially. Gibberellic acid can be produced organically. It's just made in a fermentation, a rice fermentation, gibberellic acid, and it can give you the same effect as having seeds in the berry. So that's one spray that can go on grapevines. It used to be available for backyard growers, and I don't know if it is anymore. I have not seen it the last couple years. So that's one hormone that can be used. There's another hormone that's used to color up red bunches called Ethyrel, and that is not available to you. This is ethylene gas, the same thing when you're talking about putting an apple in a bag or a banana in a bag, the gas that it releases to ripen the rest of the fruit, ethylene. So this side, you can see, was treated with Ethyrel, ethylene, and this side was not. And you can see that it's redder fruit. So, and what?
It looks larger.
It looks larger, too. It can have some effect on the size as well. So you probably wouldn't do those things. There is this one last technique that you can use, girdling. And you can see these funny rings right there. See that on the grapevine? These are recent girdles, and here are some old girdles. And what happens with girdling, and you've got to go back to your first botany class and really remember a lot of botany with this. But again, I mentioned that you need hormones, you need nutrients, you need all this stuff to make these berries plump up. Well, another way to do that is to capture all of that for a period of time way up in the top part of the vine. So it's not moving back down through the trunk and into the roots and going other places. You want to focus all that energy into your bunches. So what they do is go in and girdle the trunk of those vines. And what they're doing is taking a very special knife, it's sort of a double-edged knife, and cutting all the way around the trunk. And they're cutting through the phloem, but they're not cutting into the xylem. And they cut right down to the cambium layer. So what's happening there? The phloem is constricted. You can't get any downward movement of all that stuff, and everything is trapped up there. And they do this right when you have kind of match head-sized berries, little tiny berries. So real critical when it's done. So that's the one thing that they do. Okay, but now wait, doesn't girdling kill a tree? Didn't you learn that about with the weed eater if you girdle it, or if a gopher or a vole does that? Okay, it's a precise enough science that they know exactly how wide the girdle has to be and how deep, right at that cambium layer, which is where those cells are going to keep growing, that it will grow and reheal in a couple weeks, just enough time so that the vine won't die. If you made the girdle twice as wide as recommended, you'd kill the vine. If you make it too narrow, then it grows back too quickly and you don't get the response. So it's a very, very precise science. It has to be a certain depth or it doesn't work. The other amazing thing is it has to be completely around the trunk, has to be completely girdled. If you leave as much as 1/8 of an inch, it isn't effective. And when you buy those Thompson Seedless at the store, all of those vines you see driving down Highway 99 that are table grapes, they're girdled. Somebody is out there girdling every one of those vines every year. Remarkable amount of work. Do it a few times and you'll see. It's fun. The bark tends to slip. At that time you can cut pretty easily. You scrape off sort of the bark and then you just make this special cut. The knives are fairly expensive. They're about $40 if you're interested in buying one. I got the information on that. I typically bring one with me and I forgot it. But if you ever want to borrow one or see one, let me know and you can borrow my table grape knife. So that's primarily what you're going to do on table grapes. Thinning, lots of thinning, more thinning. You may want to do some girdling. If you wanted to, you could play around with a knife and just do some simple girdling with them. And I think that's my last slide, unless anybody has any questions. Yes?
What stage do they start the girdling?
What stage do they start the girdling? It depends on variety. It depends on the variety of grapes, and it tends to be when, like I said, they're about match head size or pea-sized berries. Really depends. You can do 2 girdles. Sometimes they'll do a girdle for sizing, to size up the berries, and a girdle for ripening. Same effect. They'll do it later in the season to stimulate ripening.
Actually removed.
When is the cane actually removed? The next year.
So at the end of, say, this year,
Okay, so yeah. Okay, if you had, the pruning demonstration, we didn't have any cane pruned vines, and it's impossible to do if you don't have one. But okay, so you've left your cane for this year. Now, so it's growing like this, and it's got all these buds along it, and those are going to grow shoots like this, and they're going to have the bunches on it. And that's going to be all the fruit that you pick, and you will have tied it onto a wire or something. Okay, so then those are going to lignify and get all woody, and then it's dormant, right? You have to go in and prune. You're going to take that off that winter. So you use it 1 year. Now you may choose to keep the little basal end. Maybe that first shoot that came off of that is in a pretty good position, and that might be your cane for next year. but you could use something coming off of there, but it would probably be way back towards the base, not out here, because pretty soon your vines are going to keep creeping all over the place. Although that could be how you build an arbor. Does that make sense? At the end of the growing season. Yeah, not a special trip through, but when you do your normal pruning. And we talked about this in the pruning demonstration, but in case you weren't there, you want to prune as late as you possibly can before bud break, especially in the foothills. It gives you a couple weeks of frost protection, and it protects you against another disease that I didn't talk too much about called eutypa. So prune as late as you can. Two things that show up for master gardeners that are really big problems. You're going to get powdery mildew. You're going to get the question, I have Thompson Seedless and it doesn't have any fruit on it. That's the cane pruning one. The other thing that you will see a lot of is these deformed, distorted leaves in grapes. And what that probably is damage from Roundup or 2,4-D. Grapevines are very, very susceptible to those two things. And then invariably they're going to go back and they're going to say, I didn't use that. You didn't use any 2,4-D? No, I didn't use any 2,4-D. Did you use weed and feed on that lawn? Yeah, keep in mind weed and feed has 2,4-D in it. And 2,4-D, when I was in Washington State working, 2,4-D applied in Idaho could cause damage in eastern Washington. It drifts that much that you could be using it in one part of your yard way away from the vines and you could be getting damage. Roundup has to come in contact with it, but again, people can be pretty sloppy. And sometimes you'll see that they get the Roundup damage late in the season. You know, they use it in August or September. They aren't even aware they have a problem, and the symptoms don't show up until spring. So those I see Roundup damage, and it's bubbly, distorted little leaves. Aphids don't do that. Aphids don't get on grapevines. That you'll see as problems, powdery mildew and pruning, are probably those are the biggies. Anything else? Everybody's ready to go. Thanks, everybody.
The preceding presentation is part of the UC Master Gardener series. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time when other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook contains over 700 pages of in-depth information on topics such as soil, fertilizer and water management, plant propagation, weeds and pests, lawn care, landscape design, home vegetable gardening, and the wide variety of garden crops that are grown in the Golden State. The chapters in this handbook provide helpful information on selecting varieties, planting, growth cycles, pruning, irrigation, and harvesting. The California Master Gardener Handbook is available along with other gardening publications on the A&R Catalog website at anrcatalog.ucdavis.edu.